Again, we are so glad and thrilled that you are here with us tonight. I hope you had enough to eat, and if not, you have no one to blame but yourselves, right? And there's plenty more, so don't hesitate. If you get a hankering for something sweet or tasty, come grab something more while Pastor Denny is speaking. I'm going to turn this over now to Pastor Denny Hanson, and he does have a little piece for y'all to sing, so you need to sing up. Did you hear me, y'all? Carolyn, or we're going to call on you and you'll do a solo. All right. We'll turn it over to him. We are so grateful that he is here with us and sharing his wonderful knowledge about the Danish immigrants.
They're not listening.
Get back out of here. Oh, well, I can't trump Catherine.
No.
I'm not brave enough to do that. All right, Denny, they're all yours, my dear. Good luck.
I think this, yeah. And feel free to move around whenever you want to, because I did have to adjust from that. When I moved from Osage, Iowa to at Nazareth Lutheran Church, one of the first things that I had to get used to is that nobody sits still at Nazareth Lutheran Church. The congregation is on the move all the time during the service. So if you need to go somewhere, go. And if I don't even blink, it's because I'm so used to it anymore that it's okay. It's a great honor for me to be asked to be able to be with you tonight. And I want to kind of start off with a reminder from the book of Hebrews. It says, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, who's the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And obviously in the book of Hebrews, just before those verses, the writer had written all the Old Testament people that we know of the heroes that were able to say they were the cloud of witnesses that kind of pointed the way to Jesus and were the first in faith, but yet we look to them and how the Lord took care of them, remembering our past as we persevere and move forward, always looking to Jesus. And so I just really believe that as both our congregations, Nazareth Lutheran Church as well as Fredsville, celebrate 150 years of ministry, a lot of cloud of witnesses have walked before us, and so tonight I'm going to be the tip of the iceberg to tell you about some of the cloud of witnesses you have, and also be reflecting a little bit on your theme. What are the happy Danes and the sad Danes, or the happy Danes and the holy Danes? What's that all about? Nazareth Lutheran Church, the church in which I serve, comes from what would have been called the holy and sad Danes. So I have that perspective. You here at Fredsville, I could just tell when I drove out here, everybody's got a smile. You are the happy Danes. So what in the world is that all about? And I hope to maybe give you a little more understanding of that. But before we do that, I just got to pull out your hymnals to hymn number 509. I have to, this is a hymn that was written by a Dane. One fact we'll be studying about him. I'll be talking about him tonight. Nikolai Grundtvig. And probably Nikolai Grundtvig's, in America anyway, the hymn that we remember the most would be God's Word is Our Great Heritage. And so I just cannot start anything about talking about Danes without singing a Danish hymn. And so we'll together sing that, and I know that you're very good at singing a cappella, so out-sing me, all right? God's Word is our great heritage, and shall be ours forever, to spread its light from age to age, shall be our chief endeavor. Through life it guides our way, in death it is our stay. Lord, grant while time shall last, most guarantee you that hymn was sung many times in this parish, probably more times in Danish than in English. A cherished, cherished hymn. I want to introduce myself a little bit and then get into talking about the Danish people. My ancestry is Norwegian and German, all right? And I knew few of any Danes before coming to Nazareth, which was just 10 years ago. And I'm a history major, so I just love history. So when somebody says, come talk about history, look out, all right? Because I just have always loved history. And during my sabbatical 3 years ago, Nazareth gave me a sabbatical, and I ended up spending the time on my sabbatical studying something of which I knew nothing, and that is the Danes. Being able to understand, in order for our preparation for our 150th anniversary this year, just as you're celebrating there. And what I found in my research, I was able to go to Elkhorn and spend some time with my wife, Dorothea. I better introduce you, or they'll be after me. We went to Elkhorn, Iowa, and spent a couple of days there in the archives there, as well as the museum, in talking to some people there. Also went to Luther Theological Seminary and spent some time in their archives and talking with a history professor, Mark Grandquist there, that is of all Scandinavian Lutherans. He's Swedish, so but nevertheless gave me great insights on the Danes too. And one of the things that I discovered very quickly, I had, since I'm Norwegian and had been in Norwegian congregations in Salem Lutheran Church in Lake Mills, Iowa, which is up in Winnebago County. There are a lot of Lutherans there. As well as then I served in Mitchell County, a lot of Lutheran area there. They say that Worth County, just to the north of Mitchell County, is the most densely Norwegian Lutherans in the world, and even more, or in the United States. And when I would say they were dense Lutherans, I thought that was kind of always interesting. But so I was used to the Norwegians, and growing up and having a part of my heritage Germans, looking at some of that history. And I will say Norwegian and German history is very complex because there were so many. And it's very difficult to try to get a grasp on the immigrations. When I got into studying the Danes, though, it was so much more fun because the Danes, there were not near as many. So it's pretty easy to figure out who they are. Also, as you'll be seeing in my presentation today, the Danes came much later than the Norwegians and the Germans. So they came later, and also another thing that is very interesting about the Danes is they kept impeccable records, especially the Grundtvigians, your type of the church, kept impeccable records of who their ancestors were, how they came, and so that made historical research a piece of cake. How many of you have been to the museum in Elkhorn? All right, yeah, very great, but that is a fantastic area to be able to see a lot. It's, in my heart, just about as good as the Vesterheim, just about, all right? All right, what I want to do is, you look at these sheets ago, and I look like I'm going to choke you, but I think I'm going to take you through a very quick history in order that we understand a little bit about who these ancestors were that came to Grundy County. And what I want to try to highlight through my presentation is what happened in Denmark had a huge, huge influence on the people who came here. Do not think for a moment that they left Denmark and left everything behind and all their past in Denmark and came to America, and that Danish and what their history had in the past did not influence them. That is not true at all. So I'm going to try to show you what was happening in the hearts and the minds, but also in the theology of what was happening in Denmark before they ever came here to Grundy and Black Hawk County. You look on this map. I have a map of that's one of the United States, 1776, and the other year. Just to give you an idea, In 1776, this would have been the size of the United States of America, 13 colonies, and so we're aware of that. By the right-hand side, 1870, look how the United States had expanded, clear across, huge expansion. Now what I want you to do is go down to the lower left, where you see in the 1800 is Denmark and the Danish areas. And what I want to highlight, this is what Denmark would have been able to have influence and control over. It would have not only been Denmark, but also Norway. Norway was under Denmark at that time, Greenland, and then also some islands to the north that I don't even know what the name of them was, but they were under Danish influence. Now, what I want you to be able to do to the right, as we get into the 1870s, which was about the time this church started in 1871, Denmark's influence went the exact opposite of what the United States. Denmark lost a lot of land. They lost Norway. They lost the islands that were to the north of Norway, and in just a huge earthquake of an experience for our Danish ancestors was the Schleswig-Holstein War that would have happened in about 1864, and that would have been when Germany took over a third of the country, almost a whole third. The Schleswig-Holstein area was ceded then to Germany. And so imagine being an American and losing a third of your country. Just imagine that. So why we wonder, why did immigration jump up so huge? That was a big reason, that war, and also just realizing that the Danish mindset at that time was they were a country that was losing part of their country, which was very, very hard. Another thing that I have to highlight before we leave this is the 1800s was a century we call nationalism. Previous to the 1800s, during the 1700s, the Scandinavians and Germans would have had they had some self-identity, but they would have never looked up to their heritage. And it wasn't until the 1800s that nationalism, when you would run around and say, I am a Dane and I'm proud of being a Dane, I am a Norwegian, that all happened during the 1800s. Now, the good part of that was people had a self-identity from their country. They were proud of their country. That can be a very good thing. You can see good things in our country. But what were the shadow side of that? It was countries were struggling to see who could have more power than others. Germany grew to be, from the early 1800s, they're just a bunch of areas that can never get united. By the end of the 1800s, Germany is united in a powerful country, and there's a lot of wars. Wars between the Scandinavians and wars in France, Napoleon over the French that want thing, and also a lot of struggle that countries had to go through. And Denmark was not left out of that. They were caught. In fact, Denmark sits in such a place that if you're going to have a war in Europe, you're sitting in the wrong place. It's you're right in the middle of it. And so a little bit to help us understand why here in the midst of when America was expanding so much, Denmark was constricting and having some huge issues as a country. But also, I cannot emphasize this too much. Our ancestors that came, whether they came from Norway or from Sweden or Denmark, when they immigrated to America, had a high view of their own country. They loved their country. And they really believed the values from their country would make America a better place. And we will talk about that a little bit later, I think, as we get into our presentation for tonight. But I think that that's very helpful to see what's happening politically in Europe and in the United States. Okay, another timeline here. As you can see, I'm a history major, love timelines, all right? But I think it kind of helped you kind of see from being able to see what kind of was happening politically there too. In the United States, we have the American Revolution. A huge historical time in the United States was the Louisiana Purchase with Lewis and Clark, where they were able to buy all that real estate west of the Mississippi River from France, and which gave great expansion of land in the United States that you could live in. I mentioned something in 1830 as Joseph Smith. Now, you might wonder, why in the world would Joseph Smith have anything to do with Danes? What I'm telling you is this, and it was a big revelation to me. When the Mormon Church got established in the United States of America, they sent many Mormon missionaries to Denmark. A lot of the early Danes who came to America went to Salt Lake City. They were Mormons, and that really caused a lot of issues in Denmark to realize Denmark was obviously the state church, Lutheran church, to be able to see so many people drawn to America and going to Salt Lake City and being connected to the Mormon faith. In fact, some of the earliest missions we hear about the Danes talking about was going to Salt Lake City and reconvert the Danes to be back to be what they would consider Christian. So that's why I mentioned Joseph Smith is really influential even in the midst of Denmark. 1846, obviously the statehood of Iowa. And then we get to, I want to look at a date of 1867. We'll be talking about C.L. Clausen, in which we do have a gentleman here from Decorah, Iowa, and we'll be talking about C.L. Clausen a little bit because he was a Danish pastor that served a Norwegian congregation and had great influence over Fredsville as well as Nazareth Lutheran Church. We'll talk a little bit about him. Also, I want to be able to show you what was happening in Denmark a little bit. Denmark was one of the earliest countries in the world to establish diplomatic relationship with the United States. And so Denmark has always had a close relationship and a great honor for the United States of America. And I never realized it until I talked to people who go to Denmark to say the Danes celebrate the 4th of July. The American 4th of July is celebrated in Denmark. Now, there may be another country in the world that does it. If there is, I don't know what it is. But in Denmark, it is a huge celebration of that. And I find that very, very unique. So we've had a very close relationship. Also, there's a few issues why I want to be able to show why Denmark had some friction with neighboring countries around them before they ever came here. In 1807, the British Navy went outside of Copenhagen and told the Danish king there that he wanted that they would either give the Navy to the British or they would sink every ship in Copenhagen because they were afraid of Napoleon in France and afraid that Denmark would connect with France. Now, I think you can pretty well imagine that if another country came to you and said, your ships are sitting there, you either give them to us or we'll shoot them down. I think you can pretty well figure out what the king said. You can't have them. So the British Navy annihilated the Danish Navy right there in Copenhagen. Now, how would that make you feel about the British? Think about that, all right? And what side of Napoleon's war do you suppose, what side did they take, the British side or the French side because of that? Duh. They said, if you can do that to us, we'll connect with Napoleon. Who lost? Napoleon. The French lost. that was why territory was taken away from Denmark because of that. And so that's by 1814 they lose Norway. The Norwegians couldn't rejoice too much because when they let go of Norway, the Swedes took it over. So they were still under domination of Norway until much later. All right. Then we have the conflict between the Germans. The Kaiser would have been in 1848 to 1850 was the first Schleswig War, and in which Denmark won that war. But then in 1864 was the second Schleswig War, which I think was 8 weeks long was all. But that was when Denmark lost that battle, and because of that, they had to cede the whole Schleswig and Holstein area to Germany. And there is where I'm going to say that's a flood of all of a sudden why immigration jumped tremendously into when you start looking at immigration to America. It was after that. In fact, I've talked to people from Nazareth that said, my grandfather was a draft dodger. What do you mean a draft dodger? They realized they lived in Schleswig-Holstein. When the Germans took over, they were going to be inducted into the Kaiser's army, and they didn't want it, and they left. They got out of there as fast as they could, or poured into what was continuing to be Denmark, which would have had the population and huge issues about so much. So it's interesting to hear that a lot of our ancestors were draft dodgers. They did not want to be in the German army, and they got out. So that would have been. A little bit about Cedar Falls before I move on to get into our theology of the happy and sad days. There are some people who have the image that Cedar Falls was established by the Danes. If you think that, you're wrong. All right, I'm just going to say that. The first Dane that we have that came to Cedar Falls was in 1855. So the whole city was here for over 10 years before the first Dane ever walked into our area here. His name was Frederick Peterson family. He came from the Schleswig area. And another key thing that as we get talking about Cedar Falls, but also I think it also affects here, is the year 1861. If you want to circle that date or just think about it, we never underestimate what influence a railroad has. The railroads first came to Cedar Falls in 1861, and it was the end of the line for a while until after the Civil War. The railroads made transportation so much easier. Before the railroad, how would you have to get from the East Coast to the West Coast? Yeah, by a wagon. All right? And think, how long would that take? Yeah, a railroad. My goodness, and I'll be explaining to you how fast A.S. Nielsen was able to get from New York to Cedar Falls. It's just unbelievable to think. Transportation, moving people happened so much easier. That's why the population began to grow, and these communities grew exponentially after the railroad, but a very, very key thing too. In 1866, we see the Danish families, which in reading your history, many of them came to Grundy County, but they did not come directly from Denmark. They were first in Wisconsin. They were around the Pine River area, which is about an hour east of La Crosse, Minnesota. I looked it up on a map. And also, I know the terrain around there because I've driven around there, and it is not Grundy County farmland, all right? So whatever Frederick Peterson or whatever some of those, when they got out of Wisconsin and started scouting the hunt country around here, they knew in Denmark what was good farm country. Pine River, Wisconsin wasn't it. It was around here. And so but our first ancestors came from Pine River, Wisconsin, so they did not come directly from Denmark, to know that too. And also, one of the things that important to know too is that some of those first ancestors fought for the Union Army. They fought in the 15th Regiment of the Scandinavian Regiment in Wisconsin. And they would have been strongly anti-slave. And I'll talk a little bit about that because not all Lutherans were anti-slave at this time. But Danes and Norwegians were. And I just imagine leaving immigrating to America, and what do? You get right into a war. But they really had that passion that slavery was one of the worst things, and they did not want to live in a country where there was slaves, and they just freely did. It's just amazing how many joined the Union Army in order to, and that was their issue, was slavery. Okay, now let's flip to, I want to get into the theological reason. I wanted to set up some nationalism, but you have to understand the nationalism and also the interaction between the countries. These countries of Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Germany did not all get along. They were not all good buddies. They had conflicts from the past. And when you have conflicts from the past, you're going to bring those conflicts with you to this country too. But also inside of Denmark, there were some theology going on, and so I get to teach you a little bit of theology here. And the first one that I want to talk about is Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig. And so you probably heard of it. In this congregation would have been called pro-Grundtvigian. You'd have been Grundtvigians. What in the world? Who was Nikolai Frederick Severin Grundtvig? He was a pastor, but also wrote many hymns. We sang part of the hymns there. Teacher, politician, was a big champion of nationalism. And so that's why, even for a time, Grundtvig was very popular in Norway, Sweden, because he lifted up the whole idea you can be proud of your country, and he was very proud of the Nordic tradition. And he brought back a whole lot of the idea that the Nordic tradition is a good one. And so a lot of people, even in the early days, Sweden and Norway and Denmark loved Grundtvig too. Also, he was a part of what spiritual renewal, because in the era in which he lived in the early, or when he was born in the 1700s, the classic theology was called rationalism. And what is rationalism? Rationalism would be that everything has to be logical, or else it doesn't make any sense. And so when you get into rationalism, if you're totally logical, miracles make no sense. And so the whole idea that there could be miracles, we didn't talk about that. Even in the midst of many people who were rationalists, would have nothing to do with the resurrection. They thought that was the biggest myth that there ever was. There could be the whole idea of resurrection was that. Grundtvig was so upset by that, he even wondered, his dad was a pastor, and he didn't even think his dad was a Christian. He said you have to have a living faith. And so he talked about a spiritual renewal of a living faith in Jesus Christ through worship. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means too. And so he was a champion of renewal and said you just have to have a living faith in Christ. The controversy, however, was what Grundtvig called matchless discovery. Now, what in the world is a matchless discovery? This is what Grundtvig argued. He said that the living Word, we talked about God's Word is our great heritage and shall be ours forever. He talked about the living Word. Grundtvig said the living Word is the Apostles' Creed that is spoken at baptism, as well as the words of institution at communion and the oral preaching of Jesus Christ. That is the living word of Jesus Christ. And that's the living word that connects and guides together the church. Now, most of us can go, okay, makes sense, yeah. But then he said this in the matchless discovery. The Bible is a sacred source book of faith, which he did that, and I've read a lot of Grundtvig's sermons. He quotes the scripture all the time. But this is what he wrote. In and of itself, it is inert and may not be identified with Jesus Christ all the time. The true and living word of God present in the congregation are the living people of God. So, in short, what did he assert? The living word was in the sacraments, the Apostles' Creed, the preached word, and that stood above the written word of the Scripture. We'll talk about why that got to be very controversial, all right. At that time, too, there was another leader in the church, a pastor by the name of Wilhelm Beck. And Wilhelm Beck was created what is called the intra-mission, the inner mission. And the inner mission had revivals. So they did a lot of revivals in Denmark. And they believed a couple things. One of them is that in order to be a true Christian, you had to have a conversion. You had to be regenerated through a conversion, or you weren't really a Christian. You couldn't just be baptized and say you were a Christian. You had to have an inward conversion. He wrote very much about believers in Jesus are saints. So maybe this All Saints Sunday lifts right into him. But what he said is that saints of Jesus had to live a life that was unstained from the world. So anything that looked like it had worldly pleasure, stay away from, because it would probably draw you away from Jesus. If you really believe in Jesus, don't get too much into luxury or pleasure. So that was an influence on that faith too. And as you can see, my last point, and I think with it, the Scriptures are the living Word of God. So you can see we have a tension between Grundtvig, who was a bishop, a big leader in the church, as well as Wilhelm Beck, who was also a pastor in Denmark under the state church, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little later too, what the state church meant. But there's a tension between those who would have been followers of Grundtvig and those who would have been the followers of Wilhelm Beck. But it was still the state Lutheran church, and those two groups coexisted within the same church, as it does today. If you go to Denmark and you go into a Lutheran church and you get talking to them, one of them will say, "Are you intra-mission?" They still have that tension between those two groups, but the tension isn't necessarily so divisive. They just kind of talk to each other and do that, but it's still there in Denmark. What I would also say about what made the intra-mission a little different is they became centered totally on the second article. They centered on Jesus Christ and what Jesus did, especially his crucifixion and death, as well as his resurrection too. But they tended not to talk much about God the Father Almighty, our first article on where God made a beautiful world and God creates this wonderful world. They spent most of their emphasis on the second article about Jesus and did not at all emphasize the first article, which thing. Now, what I found very interesting is even though they are in different camps of talking about the faith, both Grundtvig and Beck respected each other, and they talked to each other in Denmark. And I found that very, very curious that they actually respected and honored and were able, even though they had differences of opinions on what the faith looked like, what a living faith in Jesus Christ looked like, they got along quite well. Another mark of the Indra mission, and the reason they call it mission, was missionaries. They were really out to set, and in fact, they also built, they worshiped in the same state church, but they built mission houses, which they would do for small group Bible studies, as well as then to also support missions beyond their country. All right. So those are the two that I'd say they stayed in Denmark. Now, Claus Clausen is an interesting guy, and he also has had an influence when we get here to talking about Fredsville as well as Nazareth. Claus Clausen was an American pioneer, a Lutheran minister, church leader, a chaplain, as well as a politician. He did all of that, all right? He was born and educated in Denmark, but he had such health issues, he moved to Norway because somehow the climate in Norway made it better for him to breathe or whatever it had to do with his condition. So he moved to Denmark, but was a Dane. Moved from Denmark and lived in Norway. Well, he immigrated with one of the first groups of Norwegians in 1843 to Wisconsin, and if you ever go to Luther Theological Seminary and go to Muskego Church that is there, that was Claus Clausen. That was the Muskego area there. He was one of the first Lutheran Norwegians there in 1843. Then he moved to St. Ansgar, Iowa, in 1953. Now there's I have a member here from First Lutheran Church in Decorah, all right? But there's quite a controversy between First Lutheran Church in Decorah and First Lutheran Church in St. Ansgar, because they're both wondering who was the first Lutheran church in Iowa. And I don't think that hasn't been resolved yet, all right? All right, but very early, one of the first to cross the Mississippi River, set up an establishment in St. Ansgar, Iowa. Now, how did he have an influence here? He was Danish. He loved Danes. He knew that they were coming to the area. And so, and when the early Danes came, there were no Danish pastors and no Danish congregations. And so he came from St. Ansgar, Iowa, which by car ride is an hour away. Imagine a horse. But he actually, there are instances of him having church services just outside of Fredsville here, over by the dike area, before you establish your congregation in the 1870s, in order to bring baptism and communion to the Danes. Also, he was very instrumental in begging Denmark to send missionaries to America because he realized that Danes were not assimilating into Norwegian congregations, and Danes were not going to German congregations. Imagine the Germans had just taken over a third of their country. You think you're going to come over here and worship and speak German with them? Heavens, no. They did not connect well with the Swedes. And so what happened is all these Danes were coming over here with no churches. And he realized very quickly what would happen. With no faith communities, what's going to happen to the faith? Will they keep it? They're going to lose it. So he was very instrumental in writing letters to Grundtvig and said, please send missionaries to the United States of America. And he ended up being the pastor who ordained our first pastor at Fredsville and at Nazareth, A.S. Nielsen, because we shared that pastor at that time. And so he was actually, A.S. Nielsen was ordained at First Lutheran Church in St. Ansgar, Iowa. The original structure of that church is there. When you go there, you can kneel at that altar and know that 150 years ago, our first pastor knelt there to be ordained to be our pastor in that very same setting there in St. Ansgar, Iowa. All right, let's flip to, a little bit of our history of coming to America now. I want to talk a little bit about A.S. Nielsen. And A.S. Nielsen was a Danish lay missionary. And he was sent, and in your book here, I read in Fredsville, there were many letters sent from Danes that were here from the Pine River area, the earliest ones, sending letters to the bishop in Denmark. Please send us missionaries. Please send us a pastor. We need to establish a church. So your letters, but also, as I said, C.L. Clausen sent letters. And it wasn't until 1871 that this lay missionary, A.S. Nielsen, was sent over with 3 others, in which one of them happened to also be a pastor here at Fredsville, Adam Dan. And I don't know whether that name rings a bell, but I don't have a lot of time to talk about Adam Dan, very famous Danish pastor. But at any rate, of the 4 missionaries sent, Adam Dan was one of them, and A.S. Nielsen was the other. They arrived, and I want to tell you how fast. That was what the difference the rails made. They arrived in New York City in about early June, late May or early June of 1871, and were able to travel. A.S. Nielsen got to Chicago, and he started looking for Danes. He knew that there were Danes, and somebody told him there were Danes in Luzerne, Iowa. Do any of you have been to Luzerne, Iowa? Do you even know where it's at? All right, it's down by Cedar Rapids, south of Cedar Rapids, a little town. He went to Luzerne, Iowa by rail, and was able to get there and walked around, and there were no Danes there. So he went back to Cedar Rapids in the train station and heard somebody speaking Danish, and he wondered where he could find Danes. And he said, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Go to Cedar Falls, Iowa. So he headed up here the rail line, towards St. Ansgar, stopped in Cedar Falls, Iowa. But A.S. Nielsen, but as I said, he came in late May, early June of 1871, and he was in Cedar Falls, Iowa on July the 4th. Imagine that. He could ride by rail, even though he had to do all that research. He knew there were Danes in the area, but he couldn't find them until he found them, and finally found them in Cedar Falls. He showed up at what we now call the Riverview Bible Conference in Cedar Falls. Do you know where that's at? All right. It was called, and when I first read that, I had to laugh. It's called Malarkey Bluff. It was. At first I thought, that's a joke. There was a guy by the name of Malarkey at that time, that whole area. And the Danes were celebrating the 4th of July. Big, over 300 Danes. And A.S. Nielsen just shows up to that gathering. Now it was a Tuesday, it wasn't even a Sunday. They were there, and so they asked him to read the scriptures, to teach. And they were so blown away by A.S. Nielsen being able to hear their preaching in the Danish language, to be able to sing Danish hymns again, and all that they immediately started proceedings to say, we want him to be our pastor. He wasn't ordained. He tried to go back to Denmark to be ordained. Because of a bunch of hoops to jump through the Danish system. They said, you don't have enough education, you haven't studied at the right colleges. So C.L. Clausen over here at St. Ansgar said, fine, if that's the way it is going to be, I'll ordain you in America. So he went, got his family, brought him back here, and he was ordained then on November the 15th of 1871. So that makes us very historical. About 150 years ago, our first pastor, A.S. Nielsen, was ordained. Now, one thing I will say about A.S. Nielsen, he was influenced by both Grundtvig, as well as the Indra mission. Okay? So he would have known both, Vig, as well as he would have known Nikolai Grundtvig. And so he was kind of groomed and had that influence from Denmark, brought that over here. Now I want to read something from your history, because I find this is one of the most exciting things I discovered. This is when A.S. Nielsen came out here to Fredsville and went to meet him, all right? And this is before he's ordained. This is what happened. First meeting out in the country was to be held, and I'm sorry, if this is your relative, get after Lisa, because she's the one who invited me, all right? But all right, Jens Madsen. Jens Madsen lived in a log house about a mile south of Fredsville. The farm was later known as Soren Sandvold's farm. Maybe some of you know what I'm talking about. I don't know who that is. Anyway, stated it was to be held there because there were just a few Danish settlers around there. And A.S. Nielsen was to open the meeting by singing a hymn. And Jens Madsen came in with a letter, walked right into his house. And he said, now wait a minute. I have a letter from my relatives in Denmark, and they've advised me not to readily understood that this little gathering of settlers who were out here in the prairies were called together. But at any rate, he said, in the midst of this, he said, A.S. Nielsen's Grundtvigian. He's a heretic. We don't want him. And he took A.S. Nielsen out and said, get out of my house. Well, that was a good reception, isn't it? Imagine our first interview if we walk into an area and you get in. All right. All right. Now, there was another guy that happened to be there by the name of Jens Anderson. And, of course, the whole crowd, here they're thinking we're getting a brand new pastor, and that's how he gets treated in the first house. And they're afraid he's going to turn around and go back to Denmark. But Jens Peterson said, come on over to my house. And so he quietly did that. They had that prayer service, and it was as a result of that, and also the work of Nazareth, that he did decide to stay. Now I just say, if you don't think the Grundtvigian versus the Indra mission was existing, big time, even at this time, too, in his life. So I found that to be very interesting. All right, now a couple things about our history is that when A.S. Nielsen was called to be a pastor, he was called to serve both Nazareth and I think they called it Fairfield. Fairfield. That was the earliest before they became Fredsville. But he served both congregations. And in that time, he would have been about 8 years. And Nazareth and Fredsville was together from 1871. And if you can see the picture with the ship on it, you can see that Fredsville called their own pastor in 1889. So we had 18 years together. And I looked on my speedometer, my odometer as I drove. I think it's about 10 miles from Nazareth to here. And the Mustangs they had at that time were not 4 on the floor Mustangs, all right? Or the Broncos they had were not pickups. Just imagine what that would have been for the pastor for 18 years. They lived in Cedar Falls and would have to ride a horse over here to get in order to be able to get over here and serve both church. And he did every Sunday. These pastors did. Pastor A.S. Nielsen, and then also Jensen Myland, and also in your first pastor, whom you called after that, and everything I've read about this was that was peaceful. When Fredsville left Nazareth and decided their own, there was no friction. It had nothing to do with theology. It ended up being that your congregation here now had a big enough community. The immigrants had come. The church was growing large enough that you realized Nazareth could have their own pastor. You could have your own pastor. That's how that all came down. And so Your first pastor here then that you called for your own was Pastor Thompson. And the only reason I mentioned him for two reasons. One, he was from Denmark. Now, as I'll say a little bit about Nazareth, Nazareth always called pastors who were not ordained in Denmark. We did not trust Denmark ordained pastors. You did. Your first pastor was from Denmark. And
Denny wasn't even the opposite, that Fredsville didn't want pastors unless they were originally from Denmark for a while. That was my understanding.
For a while there was pushback there too, but Pastor Thompson was, everything I read.
Right, was from Denmark, and that's, yeah.
And got connected here for, and he was
that's
also.
And that's what they wanted here, was somebody from Denmark.
From Denmark, yes.
Correct.
And he was also best friends with Martin Holst. Now when I say Martin Holst, what do you know about Martin Holst?
In a printing business.
Printing business, and what did he print? Danish newspaper. All right. Martin Holst was, and I'm going to put the word was, a member at Nazareth Lutheran Church until 1896, when there was the big split between the churches, and Martin Holst was one of them that left Nazareth to build Bethlehem. So he had a very connection with Martin Holst, and also the Danish newspaper would have been very pro-Denmark, pro-state church there in Denmark, pro-Grundtvigian. No question about that. So that's just an interesting interrelationship that your congregation had with that. All right. I'm going to say a little bit about the church split between what happened, why did the church split in America, and especially the church split that happened between the Indra Mission, the Sad Danes that I represent at Nazareth Lutheran Church, and you Happy Danes. I'll try to explain what happened there. It was a convention in Racine, Wisconsin, and they were writing a new constitution for the Danish church here in America. And as they were writing the constitution, there was a resolution made that said if you didn't sign the Constitution, you were out of the church. And at the time that that Constitution was written, we had a pastor at Nazareth by the name of PLC Hanson. I'm an O-N, he's an E-N, but I say some of these Hansons were, he was a pretty fiery character who was very intermission, very much. And he refused to sign, and our delegates from Nazareth refused to sign that Constitution. Fredsville must have signed it. All right. As a result of that, we were out of the church just by not signing that. Now, as I read Nazareth history as to why that was, it's kind of interesting. I thought maybe they'd have a whole lot about the theology difference, which it was there. But the primary reason given in the history of Nazareth was they were afraid that if they signed the Constitution, that the larger church would own the local church building. And that's why they wouldn't sign. It had to do with property rights. Now, I don't know what the property rights are here or anything like that, but I just found that kind of interesting. You could have mentioned all the theology, but in our history it says, we were so afraid that we'd lose our property that we didn't sign. And so we were out. What I want to try to show you here to kind of conclude my presentation a little bit is where our two churches went from that time to think. As I said, at Nazareth, what happened is when we did not sign that, it became controversial, very controversial, because it was thought, even from the Danish state church was appalled that congregations would talk about splitting. That was not anything that was ever done in a state church. And they didn't believe it would happen. But you got to remember, the American church is totally different than the state church. The state church, you didn't have to pay offerings. You didn't give offerings. Who paid for buildings? State. Who paid for the pastors in Denmark? The government. You paid your taxes, and the government paid for your pastors. They paid for your church buildings. They had a lot. So they were able to be, it was a state church. In America, do we have a state church? No. All right? And so in America, if you don't agree with somebody, what do you do? What do you do when you're in America and you don't agree with them? You walk down the road and you build another church. We split. And that's exactly what happened. Half of the congregation of Nazareth in 1897 walked. Imagine losing half your congregation. Walked, and it split families. Whole families were split right down the middle of which one? Bethlehem and Nazareth. Now, I do know there's been, over the years, a lot of friction. I would say not now, but in the past, between Bethlehem and Nazareth. But I never, ever read anything that it was a big issue out here between Nazareth and you here, too. Now, what influence did that have on your church then? Your church is the top line, Fredsville, where in 1897 then, your seminary would have been Grandview Seminary, which was at the college in Des Moines. All right? The Indra mission would have been in Blair, Nebraska. So that's what it went. And it was, you were a part of what they called the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Our name was the United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. It wasn't until 1945 that in the Indra mission, or the Saturdanes, that they dropped the word Danish. And the only reason they dropped the word Danish is because they realized you can't remain Dane. There aren't enough Danes around to keep on coming anymore. You better have a few Norwegians and Swedes come to your congregation, or you're not going to make it anymore, after the big immigration stopped. And so they actually dropped the word Danish in there. But so your trajectory went that top line, which would have been later on the LCA, Lutheran Church of America, where you connected then when there were mergers with the Swedish. The Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church connected with the ALC, which would have been more of the Norwegians and a little more congregation and model, until we got together in 1988 to be the ELCA. Now, what I want to show you and kind of close a little bit, and then I'll entertain a couple questions. I want you to take a look at this picture on the right-hand side of the paper here. That's a Sunday school class. That is a Sunday school class at Nazareth Lutheran Church prior to 1911. I can't tell you what date it is. I know it because it's the wood frame church. I want you to look at those children. What do you notice when you look at those children in that picture?
They're not smiling.
There is not a smile on their face. And I say, this is not a staged picture. I really do believe that a part of the Indra mission was the idea that that when Jesus died for your sins and he went to that cross, that was no laughing matter. And you had to be, you couldn't smile, you couldn't look like you had a lot of fun, because if you were probably accentuating pleasure too much and not really getting into what Jesus did for you. But as I see some of these pictures, I could just sort of say, do you wonder where that pulse is in there of what the whole idea was? Also, another thing that you did out here that is different than Nazareth is that you built a community hall where people could dance, and you probably had an associate, what did they call that?
Auditorium.
We had an auditorium
Yeah.
that was out here in front.
Yeah. And so you would have things. All right. I guarantee you Nazareth wouldn't, ever, because they would have considered that way too worldly. I also know some of the stories. They said that the Nazareth people came over here. They sneaked in. And so because a part of the intermission was so worried that on that you had to make sure that you lived a lifestyle that didn't look like the world. That was one thing. But also they were very concerned about the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Grundtvigians they'd call, is that they felt that they worshiped Denmark more than they worshiped Jesus. And so a lot of that got to be some conflict between those. But as I said, for some of your houses, they still came over and did your fellowship. So it's kind of funny in how they sneaked in and still had fun.
So does that mean that the Naz folks don't dance around the Christmas tree then?
Well, we are this year. No, I'd say there's a lot of that.
There you
We're doing a Yule Fest, and we actually have a few of the. No, we're actually going to do a Yule Fest where we actually do dance around the Christmas tree. But no, they did not. That would not have been a tradition. That would have been because it would have been. In fact, it would have probably been frowned upon, simply because the other side did it. And it looked like it was too much fun. Yeah. And so that's why they were called the Sad Danes, all right? But it's really, what I think of more accurate would be the Holy Danes, a little bit. But, so I was going to think, anything, got a couple minutes here, maybe we'll go till 7. Any questions you have or something like that you might kind of wonder that I connected with that maybe you kind of say it's a part of what, between Fredsville and Nazareth or something around here?
Any questions or comments for Pastor Denny?
Good presentation.
Yeah. Dwayne.
You mentioned the Danish end of it. I have a book from the Danish Publishing House in Blair, Nebraska.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we ended up with it.
Yeah, there was quite a, and I can't remember. I know the Dannenwerk was the newspaper from Cedar Falls, and I forgot what the name of the one. Those two newspapers went after each other with like cats and dogs. I mean, they had huge issues with each other and would just write some of the most nasty editorials. But Danes would buy Danish newspapers for how long did Fredsville retain the Danish language? Do you know how? Do you have any idea?
What
when?
was it, Sue? Is it 39, something like 1939-ish?
And I, having been around Nazareth, I can tell you, they are rich. Or they are very Danish. They had great pride for their Danish ancestry, and we stayed with the Danish language for quite a while. In fact, there was big discussions in our. When I read our history books about, they'd always put like I don't know why you'd put it, annual meeting reports in a history book, but they do. But year after year, they had, like 10 years in a row, they had big fights over whether they should switch to English or not. They got voted down every cotton picking time. No, we're going to stay in Danish. I don't think they said Jesus spoke Danish, but I think they thought so.
Yeah, and it was prior to that
It was hard to leave the Danish language.
Yeah, it was prior to that they had moved to doing it one Sunday a month. But I believe it was like 1939 that they removed the Danish language altogether. Yeah.
So I got a couple books. One is about, if you want to study about the Danish Lutheran Church in America, this would have been the group that you would have been a part of here at Fredsville Lutheran Church, in which Fredsville is mentioned in here several times, especially with your pastor, Adam Dan, one of the most interesting guys I've ever encountered. But anyway, also another thing that's interesting, I read somewhere, and I wish I could have put my finger on it, but Nikolai Grundtvig's son was Friedrich, and he came to America, very controversial guy in America, obviously between the two churches, but he was actually here in Fredsville. So I got to think here, Nikolai Grundtvig's son was here, And I think it was at the time Adam Dan was here to make a visit. All right, so that's one. This is the one, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church, where it went. That'd be the Indra mission, where Nazareth is a part of. And then one other book that I think is also very fascinating that is Danish immigration to the United States. And one of the things that really I think was an earthquake for our congregations had to do with how immigration stopped. And I didn't even know this till I started my research, and that is that Danish immigrants poured into America, especially in the late 1870s. Most of your ancestors, I'm sure, would have come between 1875 to 1900, many. But they continued to pour into our country from Denmark because we had all this land, and people kept saying, look at this good Grundy County land. Wouldn't you like to farm? They got here and said, of course. All right? So farms were growing. They were growing. Immigration was very strong from Scandinavia through World War I. But after World War I, the United States government in the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, stopped all immigration from Europe to America. Did you know that? Unbelievable. In the 20s. Why? It was a negative reaction to World War I. So many people in America were angry about that war, said, why did we ever go to Europe and sacrifice so many doughboys from the United States of America over a European war? And because of the anti-war sentiment, they literally said, nobody. We're going to accept nobody from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, or Germany into the United States of America. And when you look at the statistics, it's just unbelievable. We have thousands coming in to hardly none in 1 year. How did that affect our congregations? Where in the world were we getting our growth? From Europe. The Danes that were coming over here, they loved to hear the Danish language and come to our congregations. And I think that our pastors and our people would have kept thinking the immigration is going to continue to come and to come to America. And one morning they woke up and no more ships were coming across to America. And all of a sudden they had to figure out, we better figure out a new way to be church because the boats are done. They're not coming over. And so the immigration stopped very, very quickly, which I think shocked a lot of people. Any other questions for us?
I want to comment that
Here,
we
hold
have
up.
a pastor's wife.
I know it's your thing.
I know a lot of you still remember Pastor Stube. Well, before he married his wife, she lived in Minneapolis, and she ran a big home for the Danes that came over from Denmark. It was a place for them to come and live, and she wrote in this article that exercise was very, very important to the Danish people. So they exercised a lot, and that's why we built our auditorium, because it was big enough to play basketball. There was a place for a rope going up the wall that they could go up the wall, and a lot of activities. They believed in exercising and being in good health.
That's good. Any other thing to just kind of think about? But what I do want to underline, you have a fascinating congregation. You have here at Fredsville and Nazareth together, in the sense that you are, or we could say we are, one of the first Danish Lutheran churches in Iowa. There's no question about it. There was no official Danish Lutheran church before A.S. Nielsen was ordained. So I just think to be able to realize, we're pioneers in this area, but also to just reflect upon 150 years of ministry. You sit around and talk to others, go, they can't even admit, 150 50 years. That's quite a thing. And so I think to be able to be a part of that, but also realize the reason we're at where we are for ourselves has to do with those who have been before us. And I just hope that we can continue to carry that torch in order that that faith and that vision to be able to make Christ known, to share him, that faith continues to be strong through as we pass on that torch to the next generations too. So I'm done. Yeah.
Okay, wait. Dick has,
I don't need it.
well, we want you to do it for that. Okay. Thank you.
I know I shared this with you a little bit before when we sat down after we didn't. I graduated from Cedar Falls, and I was raised Lutheran from the old Nazareth Church in Cedar Falls. We had to pray at every meal. We had to pray before we went to bed. I have 3 brothers, and we had to get on our knees and pray in Danish. Not English, but Danish. And we go back to the church, to the old church, the one that was across the alley from the brick church, which is on 9th and Bluff today. And we had to walk to church. And what I'm leading up to is that we prayed in Dane. My 3 brothers and I, we had to pray to our mother and father in Cedar Falls, in Dane.
How special to have those memories and do that but hey.
Anyone else? Merlin? Okay.
I shared this with Pastor Hanson earlier, that I said my mother's family was involved in this split in the Nazareth church. And so it affected a lot of people. And it split that family. There was 12 children in the family. And some of them went Grunt-Deacon, and some of them went the other way to the Bethlehem church. And it really split their family. And they were devoted Lutherans there. As I said, one of their sons, there was 12 children in that family. One of their sons became a Lutheran pastor, and I think another of their daughters married a Lutheran pastor. So they were very Lutheran, but to get split like that, their family, it really was very, very hard on them.
Very hard. And as Danish pastors come to America, and then I learned this in Elkhorn when I was there, one of the things they cannot understand is why the church split. That's one of the things. Why do Danish pastors come to America? They say we can't understand that. Why is it that people they don't have to agree on everything? Why did they have to split? And they just do not understand at all the difference between a state church, where you could meet together and do that, but also the difference between the free church, that if you don't like somebody, that's how you don't resolve the issue. You walk and you create a whole other thing, which causes a lot of other issues. But as I say, it's still a very confusing thing to Danish pastors to come over here and say, we just don't understand why you had to split and go 2 different directions. So, but again, I think you mentioned it too. You were talking to me a little bit about back in the 70s. You were part of Nazareth, but your kids wanted to they were around Dyke because you were teaching there. And what did Homer Larson say? There's a really good Lutheran church right outside of Dyke. All right? Fredsville. All right? But what I'm saying is, isn't that a great thing to be able to say, by the time we got to the 1970s, these theological issues, we'd gotten past that, and we were able to say to one another, we could pray together, we can encourage, if you're going to be a good member and be connected to that faith community, that's a good one, go there. And they preach the gospel too. And to have Homer Larson tell you that they preach the gospel, you know they preach the gospel. All right? But what a neat thing we have between our our faith
And you
community.
had good-looking boys from Nazareth that I went to camp with, too.
Yeah, all right. I think we should end with that one.
You think so?
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Anything else for Pastor Hanson? First of all, will you please thank him?
Yeah.
You know, if you do question any of like the splitting of the past, you don't have to travel very far when you think about the Danes and the Germans, because a mile, as the crow flies, is a German cemetery. You know, because the Germans could not be buried, because you wouldn't want to spend all of eternity being buried next to a German, you know. So those things last, you know, and are real and part of it. I would say that, you know, what a blessing to have colleagues like Denny and Pastor Brian and Pastor Amy at Bethlehem, and that all of us have such great love and respect for each other, and that we do have such ability to say, you know what, if that's where you need to be, you go there, because that's a great pastor and a great church. And to be able to say that, you know, and really mean that and lift each other up as pastors. Let's wrap up tonight with some prayer, shall we? Let's pray. Holy and gracious God, we give you thanks for all the saints who came here and settled in this part of Iowa, for those who risked it all, who brought with them the gospel message to be proclaimed, who paved a path for all of us and shared the good news so that we all too might live their life, their calling, and share the good news with others. For the people of Nazareth, the people of Bethlehem, for their pastors, Holy God, bless their ministry, watch over them, guard them, guide them, bless their evangelism and their growth in your name. Holy God, for this night we give you thanks, and we rejoice that we could come together to learn and to celebrate and to be empowered to leave here proclaiming your good news. And all God's children say, Amen. Thank you very much. The only other announcement I really want to make, just kind of watch. We have lots of like little anniversary stuff coming up throughout the year. But you lifted up a couple of books, Pastor, and there's a book on my desk. And what it is it's letters written by Danish women back home. It's called, the book is called Tante Hanson. And we will, on December 7th, a group of women in the congregation, as part of the service, be reading a number of those letters as part of our Advent service, and sharing some of that information. So that will be a very special service, and hope that some of you, if it works into your schedule, will be able to join us for worship on December 7th. So thank you very much for coming. Drive safe on your way out of here. It's dark. So drive safe, and blessings on you. Thank you.